Hello, everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us today for a discussion on how to grow and scale your feature management process. This is a LeadDev webinar created in partnership with Statsig. The webinar, we're going to last for about 45 minutes or so, after which myself and the panelists will head over to the LeadDev Slack, where we can answer some of your questions in the technical strategy channel. We may also have time to answer some questions live if we can, so please feel free to submit those through the Zoom Q&A, and we'll get to them if we have time towards the end. Before we dive into the questions, good to introduce ourselves. Firstly, my name is Jack. Nice to meet you all. I'm a technical lead at Google, where I work on Chrome tooling and specifically web performance. Today, I'll be joined by Dom, Mike, and Tor to share their experiences and insights. I'll let them introduce themselves, so we'll go one by one. So please say hello to Dom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dom, and I am a full-stack engineer working on web apps predominantly. I'm super excited for today's session because it's so core to what we do in tech. We're all constantly releasing new features and testing our performance, no matter what industry we're in, how big or small our teams are. I mean, I've worked on teams of 2 to 7 engineers with and without UIs, and there's been a lot of learnings throughout. So I'm super excited to share those and hear more about how feature releases look in other areas from Mike and Tor.
Cool. Thanks, Dom. Mike, I'll hand over to you.
Oh, hi. So I'm Mike. I'm the director of engineering at Buffer. And same, I'm so excited to get to discuss all about feature management, launch, all the stuff. I feel like it's so ingrained, like Dom was mentioning, in all the stuff that we do. And at the same time, it's something that it has a lot of I guess anxiety, concerns, fears, so many things that are in the back of our minds for all of us in the software ecosystem. And so getting to share what's been working well, learning experiences and so on with all of you, it's really, really exciting.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And last but not least, Tor.
Hey, everyone. I'm Tor. I'm a software engineering manager at Statsig. And it's funny because we're sponsoring this webinar. I thought that I was going to come in and have to be the person to teach people things, but actually just in talking to Mike and Dom and Jack leading up to this, I've already learned so much. And it's been super interesting to see all of the different practices that are going on across the industry. So I'm really excited for everyone to get exposed to a lot of different perspectives today.
Awesome. Thank you, Tor. And yeah, welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So obviously we've got a bunch of questions lined up around feature management and releases. But before we dive into those, I think it's good to lay a little bit of context for everyone following along. So again, we'll go in the same order we just went. If I could just ask you to give a quick summary of sort of the things you work on, are we talking web, mobile, a bit of both, kind of size and scale, all that kind of stuff, just to lay some context before we dive into the specifics of the release processes. So again, I'll just stick to the alphabet. So Dom, we'll start with you.
Good way to. So I've mostly worked in full stack web areas where generally we'll do a release a couple of times a week. Though when it comes to feature testing in particular, I'll admit there doesn't tend to be as much of it happening on the API side as the UI from my experience. So when it comes to feature releases, it's mostly been reskins and A/B tests of user web journey. It's like an onboarding flow where you might want to test showing user benefits in different areas of the page or even splitting it out onto another page. But yeah, mostly the UI web side of things.
Awesome. Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, so at Buffer, we have both web app and mobile apps. So feature releases, we aim many of them to be in sync. So there's a lot of orchestration to make sure that, things like feature flags and so on work together. But on the website, we definitely release more often than on apps. We release on the daily, every engineer, it's working and integrating the code to the main branch and to production. As soon as possible, always. So yeah, that's the way we go.
Awesome, thank you. And finally, Tor.
Yeah, so I work on the SDK and integration side of the house for us, and so it's a little bit of everything. It's mobile SDKs all the way to backend, and then integrations with popular data processors like your segments and things like that. So a little bit of full stack, a little bit of mobile, a little bit of web servers, a little bit of fun all around.
Awesome, a little bit of everything. Thank you. And I should also apologize. I was so excited to get into the questions and hear from the panelists. I actually skipped a little bit of context as to what we're going to be talking about. So my apologies for that. Let me just quickly jump back before we dive into the nitty gritty. So we all know that we spend a lot of time building features, but once they're designed and built, there's still a long road ahead in terms of get those features in front of users and iterate on them and manage them going out into the wild. Shipping changes to software is pretty inherently a risky business. And you've got to manage technical challenges, user expectations, and ensuring their stability as your product as you go. So today, what we're going to be doing is discussing strategies to manage those feature releases, how you can mitigate the risk of shipping features to your users, and it's moving just a smooth rollout. That means smooth for your users, also smooth for you internally as well, with hopefully as little stress and complications as possible. So apologies, I've done it in slightly wrong order, but we'll kind of dive into the nitty gritty now and kind of hear from our panelists about how they approach and think about these things. So the first thing I want to dive into is actually understand what releases mean to each of you in your roles and what those look like. This time, Tor, I'll start with you just to mix it up. So what does the release look like? How often are you doing releases? And sort of generally, what's the process look like where you are at the moment?
Yeah, so for us, it's we've got a number of different release cadences, and it's all based on managing risk, as you were talking about. So how risky is some sort of change? So on one end of the spectrum, we've got like our marketing site and our documentation site. That's pretty much continuous delivery. You merge a change, it's going out immediately. Very low risk. We can always revert something quickly if we need to, but it's also important to get that out in front of people as quickly as possible. And then on the other end of the spectrum is really the work that I'm doing on SDKs and integrations, right? If we're publishing a library that's going out there, there's a binary going out there, people are going to start pulling it into their mobile apps, their web servers, things like that. And so it requires a lot more testing, ability to control things remotely, toggle them on and off for specific languages, specific SDK versions, specific companies, all of that kind of control that you need because the level of risk is just so much higher. And then in between, we've got like our web app and our backend. We try to push that on like a daily cadence, often developing things behind flags and things like that as they're under development.
Nice. And Mike, I guess at Buffer, you have a wide range that's probably similar. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of call out or mention particularly?
Yeah, I think in the last few years, we've been in a journey to like speed up our release process. And I think like one key, or one fundamental item for us was to detach what it was like integrating with production and shipping things to production versus releasing it to the public, right? So having that separation was fundamental. We used to have cycle time of like 200 hours in average, perhaps. So it will mean that, yeah, like from the first commit to actually like shipping something to production, it will take that much time in average, whereas now we are around 24 hour in average or less than that. And so like just like going on that like continuous delivery flow that Tor was mentioning, and really like, yeah, working on getting those releases small, and that we could build something incrementally before we have the confidence to really like open the gates to our users was really fundamental for us in the release improvements that we've been doing.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think everyone kind of wants to hit that continuous deployment, rapid releases, regular releases, but then at the same time, if that's happening constantly throughout everyone's day, that there is inherently a lot of risk floating around as those are flowing through. So Dom, I'll come on to you. This kind of leads us perfectly into the next kind of question. What does your approach look like for mitigating risk? What are some of the strategies you put in place to try and reduce the risk as you roll out new features?
Good question. I think there's a lot of sort of best practices out there, like quite popular and like rightful advice of testing in multiple environments, writing good tests, breaking down the work into manageable chunks. But what I found to be like most impactful is just making things easy to test. And I'll underline the word easy, really. Because we've all been there when maybe your feature has 5 different variants for different user types. And if you make like a 1 or 2 line change, how likely is it that you'll go and log in as all of the 5 user types and check it hasn't broken anything for any of them? I think we all know the answer. So being able to quickly mimic a user type for a query string, for example, makes it easier and much more likely that that change is going to be checked properly. And another way, I think in the same vein, is breaking down feature flags granularly. That also can make things easier. So for example, let's say you're working on a big reskin of a multi-step onboarding journey, making your feature flags quite granular. So for example, one feature flag per step instead of the whole journey being a one feature flag can make it easier to test, as QAs or designers looking at the different pages can flick them on and off completely independently of each other. Like I've had it before where we tried to use one big feature flag to control something similar. And it was quite difficult to collaborate because designers would flick it on to check the new version. QAs wanted to have it off for regression. And it just created this weird, unnecessary saturations and rushing. So from my point of view, the key to mitigating the risks comes from making testing painless, or as painless as testing can be, essentially.
There's always got to be some pain when testing's involved, I think.
Yeah.
We can't fully get away from it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think actually that's now all three of you have mentioned feature flags at this point. So it's interesting to hear how you've kind of used them on quite a very granular level. Tor, I think you first mentioned them as well. Have there been sort of any other ways you've used feature flags, or like how does your usage of them look like? Is it similar to Dom's? Or are there differences?
Yeah, I think similar to Dom, and then Dom, I don't know if you guys do this, but one of the things that that we'll do along with like granular flags is then chaining them together. So you have like one master flag, which each of them kind of depend on, and then you can turn them all on at once from that one master flag. So that's been something that's really helped us break down something into each of its smaller pieces, but then also be able to roll them all out at the same time. Is that something you guys do?
I haven't experienced that so far, but that is actually such a great hack, because something I've been working on recently has 10 feature flags, and I was just kind of breaking my brains and like, how do I flick them on at the same time, make sure it's all on? So that is a great tip. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably one of the coolest uses I saw of that trick was at Facebook when COVID just started. Everyone's working from home, right? Like usage on all of these services is just skyrocketing, and like you literally can't pour concrete fast enough to build data centers to like support that kind of load. And so there was this huge internal push to like be able to turn off features if they needed to have more capacity on the web tier. And so they created like a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 flag. And you could kind of take each of those features and decide if like, okay, this isn't the worst thing if we turn it off for tier 3. And then like in tier 1 was like turn off newsfeed ranking, which would be like, you know, nuclear level, just to like keep things up and running. Fortunately, they never had to go to that level, but it was just this massive web of feature flags that they created. I think they might have had to toggle the level 3 at some point. And people found just like lots of interesting optimizations and cost savings along with that.
What's quite interesting, that sounds really cool, but as you mentioned, it kind of felt like a web. Do you know of a way that they made it feel less like a web, so that if you do have to flick someone on and off, it was quite like easy to understand what you're doing exactly?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the main thing was like the there was like an infrastructure team that was in charge of like the top level 3 flags, but then each team and organization was in charge of their own. And so you didn't really need to be aware of everybody else's. You could kind of operate independently in your own space, and then just make one of those tiers basically depend on your features. And so you never really saw, it would be super interesting to see the graph, and I wonder how many different flags were in there at the end of the day. But yeah, you didn't really have to see it all to contribute to it.
And it's a question actually that's come from the audience, but I was going to ask anyway, because it's interesting. Obviously, as you add more and more feature flags, and Dom, you're talking about how you break down one big feature into potentially multiple feature flags. Again, is there a point where that becomes like overwhelming to you? Do you ever have time to like clean them up? Like, you know, do you have tooling to help you manage those? Like when you come to actually wanting to put those in front of users?
A great question. I think in terms of code cleanup, I have lots of tips and ideas I've been experimenting with recently, but in terms of feature flags, maybe a bit less. But I remember, I don't know if it was you, Mike, when we sort of were talking earlier, that mentioned a lifespan for feature flags. I don't know if that would be quite good. to chat about, just kind of going in with the mindset that this will be over on this day and marking that and kind of sticking to it. I'm happy to talk about the code part as well, if that would be helpful. Or I don't know, Tor or Mike, if you've got any other tips on the feature flag specific parts.
I mean, I will definitely love to hear more about that code cleanup part. I think on our end, it's a lot based on, well, when we have already like gone through like the launch or the experiment has finished, like it's part of like the definition of them. Like, you need to go back and just clean that up, like remove that feature flag, remove the instrumentation, etc. We've been like handling this code base for now like 14 years, so we've been impacted by like feature flags that have been living for years and nobody knows why they still need to be there, right? Like that sort of like primal fear of messing with something that's been for too long. So definitely we want to be like more careful now and more active with treating those as soon as possible.
That makes sense. And Tor, we obviously talked a lot about feature flags, and that lets us manage who can see a feature at any point in time. Tor, on your side, do you have a specific kind of guidance for, do you roll out to, let's say, 5% of users first, then 10%, then up it from there? Or do you just, does it depend on the feature and what it is you're releasing?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different answers here. So one is like you have to decide what unit you're going to roll out based on, right? So for some people, if you're like a B2C company, then you're rolling out to a percentage of your user base. But if you're a B2B company or something, maybe you need to roll out to a percentage of company. So everyone in the company gets the same experience as you continue to roll out. So that's kind of the first decision vector that we have, is like, does everyone in the company need to have the same experience or not? Or can this be user based? And then the other thing that we recommend actually is incrementing it in multiples, such that you can start to get better signal at each level. So, excuse me, sorry. Going from like say 1% to 2%, you might not see that much of a difference as you're monitoring metrics and things like that. And so we recommend going from like a 2% to a 10%. You do a multiple of 5, 10% to a 50%, another multiple of 5, and then potentially rolling all the way out or rolling back at each of those phases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Places I've worked, it's been really beneficial to be able to roll out to a certain percentage and just increase it as you get confidence, as feedback begins to roll in. Nice. We'll definitely return and talk a lot more about feature management. And feature flags as well. I can see a couple more questions around those. But just to sidestep briefly, Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts. We talk a lot about release processes and managing risk. Is there something that stands out to you over, let's say, the last year or so, give or take, that Buffer or you have changed in your release process that's made a big difference? Like, how has there been any kind of big wins there you've had?
Yeah, I think I can think of like two sort of like areas. One is like the more like technical, like I'm personally obsessed with fast feedback loops in general. So as much as we can streamline something, like the better. And for the release process, we've gone through quite a big migration of just using like our regular GitHub action setup to manage the whole like build and deploy process, to now using Argo CD because we use Kubernetes. And this has like helped us like streamline that build process where we had redundancies before and rework. And so like now it's faster to deploy, but also it's immediate to roll back, which is also something that I think it's very important. Sort of connecting it with like managing risk, right? Like I think in a big way, it's sort of like knowing or being aware that things do happen and that you will need to react to it, right? So that resilience, it's important. And connecting it with that concept of resilience, we have recently released a blog post in the Buffer blog, because over the summer, as we've been rolling out a particular like rewrite and UI change and so on of one of our like most like used areas in the code base, we faced some performance challenges, and that like caused like incidents, downtime, etc. And that has forced us as well to step up in our incident management process, which I think goes hand in hand with the release process. It's part of the release process, really. So from going on like not only like reacting to things, but actually like making mandatory postmortems that the action items are prioritized just as along feature work. It's not like something that doesn't belong to the team, right? It's part of like the team's backlog, and they need to prioritize it alongside all of that. And really, like, I guess like the maxim, or like the key thing to keep in mind is that incidents do happen, but the key thing is that the same incident doesn't happen twice, right? So we have learned the system is more resilient. Us as a team are able to react better, and so on. And that's like, to me, like that's a huge improvement for the actual release process. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I love the mindset that the release doesn't finish when the code is live and users are using it. You know, you've got any hypothetical instance that may happen, and learning from those. I think in my experience as well, it's important to, if something goes wrong, which at some point it will, like no one can ever ship software that always works. It's important to stay like blame free. We're not looking for an individual who made a mistake. We're looking at why the systems enabled this mistake to not be caught at the various different layers that you would have. So I really like that approach and thinking about the incident management side. That leads us nicely. I wanted to loop back to Dom, something you mentioned earlier. We're talking about what happens after you've shipped something. So hopefully you've shipped something, used feature flags to roll it out. It's all happy. Everyone's can kind of breathe and relax. You mentioned like tidy up and managing. You know, Mike, I think you said you've got feature flags that have been around for 20 years and no one knows what they do anymore. Dom, what are some of the techniques you've used to kind of do the sort of post-release cleaning, if you like?
Yeah, totally. It's that kind of speed versus safety balance, isn't it? I mean, by nature, new features are super cool and shiny, so we're naturally excited to do them. But let's face it, no one has ever been thrilled by the cleanup. And for me, the way to, again, get people to clean up and just get it to happen properly is to make it easy. Again, I feel like that's going to be the theme of my answers today. Yeah, quite often we can just whack lots of new code in and not even think about the tech debt that we're creating or the removal of old pieces until post-launch. And what that can mean is that we never actually remove the old code, or during its removal, we accidentally create new bugs because we no longer remember which bits of the styling are for the old version, for example, or it's just not that clear. So to me, it's all about a mindset shift, whereby as soon as you start thinking about a new feature, start discussing it, you also start thinking about what you're going to do to get rid of the old code after it has been fully in production. And a great habit that I've gone into is creating cleanup tickets and referencing them as to-dos in the areas of the code that will have to be removed. Or, for example, moving the styling that's only relevant to the old version under a specific CSS class extension like --old. So now that I know when we come to clean up, I can just delete that whole chunk and not even worry about it. It's making that bit easy that I think has worked the best for me so far. It does create a bit more work up front, but I feel like it sounds almost worse than it is. You know, once you do something, you're like, oh, okay, that wasn't that bad. I feel like it's just one of those cases. And to me, it hasn't like impacted my ability to ship quickly, but it has provided a lot of great benefits in saving time and the guesswork that comes kind of later down the line if you don't do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it sounds like something Mike was touching on when you're talking about post-instant release, assigning tasks and make sure they happen. I think my question, Mike, we'll go briefly back to you, and then I'd love to hear Tor's thoughts as well. It's like, how do you incentivize the people to do that work, right? And I don't mean that because they don't want to do it. I just mean it's natural. I think you ship a feature and then everyone gets excited about, okay, now we've shipped that. Here's the next 10 features we'd love to build, or the product manager is figuring out what new shiny thing we can ship next quarter. Like, how structurally as an organization do you incentivize ensuring all that cleanup work kind of goes ahead?
I think it's something that I guess like you always somewhat like need to be like aware of what's like the vibe of the team, right? Like there's moments that it ebbs and flows, but definitely I think one thing that has helped us, it's really like realizing that in a way that speed and quality are not at odds with each other, right? Like if we really like care for like the quality and the maintenance of our code base, it allows us to get to this sort of constant speed, really, which is what we want. It's like we don't only want to release today, we want to keep releasing tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, right? So I think like having that mindset and really like, as I was mentioning before, like making sure that there's no, let's say like product backlog and a technical backlog, but rather that no, like the team needs to make like that prioritization together, and that everything is a business decision. It's been really helpful, I think, to make sure that it's included, and it's, even if sometimes it's not prioritized or not always like prioritized in the same way, it's explicitly talked about rather than just something that gets forgotten.
Yeah, I love that approach. I've always felt that if I've worked in places or seen teams where they say, okay, next week is going to be the tech debt week, and then we're back to product work. But I think that just, it creates the wrong messaging, and it never works out. I love the idea of kind of bringing them together. And also it sounds like as well, you're very pragmatic in terms of accepting that now and then you just need to accept a bit of tech debt because the company needs you to ship a certain thing by a certain point. So I love the way you can kind of balance those. Thank you. We talked, I'll sort of loop us back around to feature flags. Tor, I know you use them a lot, as we've talked about, to manage rollouts. I think you also mentioned using them for A/B testing. But then this kind of approach, if you've got feature flags that are being used for multiple different sort of concepts, if that's A/B tests, feature flags, whatever else it may be, it sounds like very quickly, and we've touched upon this, you get into a very confusing state where there's loads of flags. We don't know if we need these. Is this A/B test completed? Are we still working on this feature? How do you even begin to classify them and deal with that and ensure that the post cleanup that Dom and Mike have talked about has happened, but also you don't incorrectly remove something that another team is still maybe experimenting on?
Yeah, I've got a lot to add on this topic, I think.
Great.
But first, I'm going to start with a counterexample. I'll start with another story. One of my friends, who's now actually our head of engineering, was trying to run an experiment to see what the impact on load time was for a particular product. How much would that impact product usage? So basically, the question was like, should we spend a few months optimizing how quickly this product loads, and what will that do to the user experience and retention, daily active users, all of that kind of stuff. Rather than spend a few months doing the work, the easiest way to test that hypothesis is actually just to artificially slow down the load time. So he introduced a flag to artificially slow down the load time by like half a second or something to measure what would happen. Overall, I think they didn't find much of a difference, and so they didn't end up spending those few months optimizing load times for that particular product. I'm not saying that holds for everyone. I don't think that's true generally. But that flag lived around for years because nobody went and cleaned it up. And so for some people, they were always getting this slowed down load time for years and years. So that's just to say nobody's perfect. Even the head of engineering at a feature flagging company, who I'm throwing under the bus right now, sometimes forgets to clean up his feature flags. But I think one of the things that we've found in terms of cleanup, and I see there's a few audience questions on this as well, so I'm glad we're touching on it, is A/B tests typically have a much better defined life cycle. There's a planning phase, right? Hypothesis, what metrics are you trying to move? All of that kind of stuff. There's a testing phase. Then you're actually running the experiment for usually you're going to use like a power analysis calculator and decide how long you need to run this experiment in order to get statistically significant results. Then there's like an analysis phase, and you decide, are you going to, ship, iterate, or kill this feature? That usually gives you a very well defined timeline of when something needs to live and when it needs to get cleaned up. But what we found is that same principle doesn't always apply to feature flags. And you get into this tragedy of the commons where everyone introduces them and no one cleans them up. And so what we've tried to do is bake these nudges into the product and try to detect certain times where something can be cleaned up. So there's a few different heuristics that we use, like, hey, this flag has been rolled out to 100% for 30 days. Or it's been rolled out to 0% for 30 days. Maybe you never implemented it, priorities changed, whatever it is, right? So like there's a couple of cases where like, hey, we'll send you a little reminder, like you might want to clean this up. Or hey, this flag isn't even getting any checks. What's going on with this? Can we just delete this from the UI so we don't have a huge list of 1,000 flags to parse through and all of that kind of stuff? And so I think that kind of ties in with what Mike and Dom were saying too, about like creating these as like tasks for teams as well that they have to prioritize in their roadmap. And then I think the other important thing to keep in mind was something Mike was saying, was just about like the attitude about how you're rolling out features. And we're all optimists, right? We like to think that every feature that we're building adds value. But at the end of the day, it's just not true. And what we like to say is there's usually like 3 buckets they fall into. So one of those, 1/3 of them, they'll work. Great, we should roll them out. Another third of them need some iteration before they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And then another third, like, we probably just should never have shipped, we should kill them. And so if you go in with that attitude, then you understand that, like, we need to be cleaning at least 1/3 of these up. We need to be iterating on 1/3 of these, and the other ones we can clean up right away as well. So I think that mentality really helps the engineering culture.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Just want to check, Michael, Dom, if you want anything to add to that. I've got thoughts, but I don't want to talk over you, and I'd want to make sure the panelists are heard first. Well, good. Cool. Yeah, the thing that I'm curious about with that is, using feature flags for all these things. I think there's a question from the audience which maybe relates to this as well, that I saw. If you're using these flags for A/B tests, feature flags, all the various other categories that Tor's talked about, that is obviously a lot of different features that you might be shipping to different subsets of your users. It's also just a lot of code branches for the engineers on the team to deal with. And I've been in this position where you see a conditional and there's 3 branches and they're all based on different experiments. And I'm just it takes a while for me to understand, okay, where do I need to make this change given how this particular feature impacts what I want to build. Have any of you explored, and I think I'll start with you, Mike, like automated testing to cover all these cases? Do you have tests to check different combinations of feature flags or A/B tests?
It's a good one. Not really. I think, and I actually would love to hear more about how you all might use end-to-end tests to do that. For example, I feel like on our end we use end-to-end tests to cover the main critical flows, but it's we find them quite hard to maintain, keep them up to date, ensure that they are not brittle, but also that the perhaps user data that we use, or the different user personas that we have really match and stay up to date as well with our business requirements, right? In general, again, I guess because of how much of a fan I'm of fast feedback loops, teams are over-indexing on unit and iteration tests, and there's this sort of quick feedback, both in terms of at the PR level of not only whether the tests are passing or not, but really whether code coverage is increasing or decreasing, really. So that's a huge sign of risk, right? Are we veering towards keeping things out of control? I think also one reflection that we tend to have, perhaps it's because we're a small team and it happens less often, the combination of feature flags in the same area of the code base that depend from different teams. It's that if that happens, if we have this sort of feature flag clash in the same area, perhaps it's a sign that we need to actually re-architect that part. Perhaps it's that, I don't know, that method or whatever, right? Or that module, it's doing too much, or it's being used for very different reasons. If people for different business reasons are coming to it at the same time, but at the same time, we are a team of 30 engineers, right? So we are quite small as a company.
Yeah, I recently, actually, a product I've been working on recently had a case where we had some UI that could be toggled by 2 different feature flags. And I remember I lost a day to a bug where I realized that if you only had one of them on, it didn't appear. You had to have both of them on. And that was a complete accidental blunder, very easily done. Just, a conditional was slightly wrong. And we didn't have any tests for that particular case. And also, I'd love, Dom, to get your opinion on this, because you've talked a little bit about testing and making testing easier, although I'm not sure how easy end-to-end tests ever can be. I also found that I realized that locally I would have lots of feature flags enabled that the majority of our users don't, because I'm a developer, I'm deep in the code, I'm building these features. So naturally I have the feature flags on, but all our users don't yet, because it's a work in progress feature. So I guess there are two questions for you there. Like, how do you manage the difference between your local developer environment, where you may have more stuff turned on, versus production? And then also, yeah, have you kind of explored end-to-end testing to help you manage the branches of feature flags?
Great question. I'm going to sort of swivel out of one of those because honestly, we don't tend to have that many feature flags on one page usually. And I think going back to sort of Mike's point about if you do have that happening, maybe taking a step back. Depends on what product you work on. But for example, we've had instances where there was multiple A/B tests running on the same page, and that can make the code quite confusing and different variations and stuff. But at that point, do you just take a step back and go, if we're A/B testing 3 different things on this page, are we actually testing anything? Because all of these different variants could have impacts on each other. So I would say that's one thing. Maybe if you do have a lot of this happening, depending on the area that you work on, maybe just asking that question, do we need to be doing all of these things at once? Can something be delayed? In terms of end-to-end tests, I also don't have a great answer for you. So end-to-end tests are naturally hard to mock because they are end-to-end, and feature flags tend to be controlled from a third-party software. So when you're running a whole suite, how do you access this third-party software and flick stuff on and off, right? But what I think here is great is like integration tests. And what we've used quite a lot, or what I've seen being used quite a lot, is dependency injection. That makes it a lot easier to mock a feature flag being returned as true or false, and testing those integrations between different components or different variants. That way, through kind of mocking them, injecting them. That's the best way I've found so far.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry I threw the impossible question of please make all our end-to-end tests really easy. I think we're all disappointed you didn't have the holy grail of the answer that everyone's searching for. But yeah, that
one can dream.
The dream we all have. Thanks so much everyone for talking through this. We've got a few minutes. I want to dive into some of the questions I can see on Zoom. So please, for those watching, if you have any, please feel free to put them in there. Any we don't get to, we'll talk through in the Slack channel after the panel ends as well. So there's one here which, Tor, I'd love to get your opinion on. Feature flag visibility. How do you actually define that in terms of, I gave the example of rolling out to maybe 2% and then you added 10, 50. How are you deciding who that 2% is, let's say? Is that based on a particular region, breaking it down by a particular type of user, completely random? Like, how do you think about who should we roll this out to incrementally?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for some companies, there'll be a set of like people that should never get like the early access type of features or something like that. So I think of like on our side, we never want like our sales team to be doing a demo and they're just totally surprised by some new feature or something like that, right? So we make sure that they're always opted out of those experiences. And then I think it also goes back to what I was saying earlier about identifying, are you trying to roll out across a set of companies, a set of users, a set of pods on the infrastructure side is another thing that we gate on. So we can run this on certain pods or in certain regions. So we actually have gating set up across a number of different axes that we can roll out on. And so being able to identify like, okay, is this change going to affect, only this one endpoint and this one service? So we can roll it out there versus, oh, this is going to affect every company. So I want to do a small percentage of those companies. And then at the end of the day, we do rely on randomization for that. Yes, it will be a random set of companies that will get opted into it. We recently got an interesting question from someone who was trying to say, okay, I want to roll out at like a company level, but the companies that are our customers are of different sizes. So you might have a Fortune 500 with tens of thousands of people. And so if I roll this out to 2%, that's actually like 50,000 people versus, if the randomization happens to choose a small company of 10 to 20 people, then the number of users exposed is much, much lower. And so that's one of those cases where I think you have to weigh the trade-off of, do you want to roll out on the user level or the company level, or potentially add some sort of nested ability to roll out on both axes at the same time, such that you don't get, a huge spike in traffic that you weren't expecting as you're starting to roll something out.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I guess it depends a lot on the feature as well and the context of the product too, and who you want to get in front of. I'm kind of having flashbacks to statistics at school and trying to remember all those different axes. Yeah, there's a lot of considerations there.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And another question we've just had, which I think could be really interesting, Mike, to hear your thoughts on, especially as there's a lot of kind of products you oversee. How do you monitor if a feature flag is causing issues? So let's say you've turned on a feature flag to a percentage of users and it crashes for those users, like there's a bug in it. Do you have any automated software that will pick that up and alert you generally, or like how do you kind of keep track of things like that?
No, as in like nothing that really connects automatically the feature flag with the incident. Let's say we aim to have monitoring of our systems at a very granular level for whatever we are releasing or working on. So that's the way, like usually, like if we capture like any anomaly or something, the first thought it must be related to this. For example, in this case, with like the performance issues that I was mentioning over the summer, it was quite clear as well. I guess also like back to like or to the context that we are like such a small team, like that there's like our product engineering teams are 4 in total, right? So if we are managing a feature flag or a release, it's going to be at the end of the day like a very small segment, and it's sort of easier to spot, I guess, than when you have like way more people working at once in the same system. So right now we don't need that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, sorry,
If I
Tor,
may,
please. Yeah,
if I could add on to that, I think one of the things that we've done at Statsig is actually just turn any feature rollout into a natural test, right? So anytime you're rolling out to a percentage of people, you've created a natural A/B test. So you don't have to think of this in terms of the typical experiment lifecycle, but when you're rolling out a feature to say 2% of users or something, unless the app is like completely crashing, you're probably not going to trip any anomalies or things like that, even if there is like a degraded experience. But what we do is actually calculate that as an A/B test, 2% of the people. And so you can see the impact on your metrics. And that's been something that's been hugely helpful, is just reducing this burden of like, oh, I'm not running a test, I'm rolling out a feature. But at the same time, you're getting those same metric lift calculations that tell you whether or not it's causing a regression, which you might not notice at a low percentage rollout.
How have you found like the perceptions of like other areas of the business? So for example, I'm just imagining going to my PO and going, oh, well, this is a feature flag, but it'll be an A/B test. But like, don't worry, it's not an A/B test. Have you like experienced any pushback at all? Just shifting those mindsets from like the name versus what's actually happening?
That's a good question. I don't think I've really seen that. I think we've more seen the opposite of people not really even realizing at first that they're creating an A/B test, and then being surprised on the other end when they're like, "Oh, wait, I can actually like tell the difference between these two features without necessarily having to see like an obvious dip on a chart in a dashboard somewhere or something like that." So I think it tends to be more of a surprising side effect than like a unexpected or unexplainable result. Yeah.
Nice, perfect. Well, that brings us perfectly to our time. So, firstly, thank you all for your thoughts and your wisdom. It's been really great to hear how you all think about this. Obviously, at different places with different types of products and a whole range of different kind of opinions and viewpoints. So, because releasing features is something that we all have to deal with, and there's all sorts of ways it can be done. So, it's really great to hear from you today, and thank you for your time. Thank you also to those of you who are watching, wherever you are. Thank you to those who put questions in the Zoom chat as well. We're out of time to continue discussing here, but we will all be going into the technical strategy channel on the LeadDev Slack. So please feel free to head in there if you would like to ask any follow-up questions. And any we haven't got to from the Zoom, we'll try and cover there as well. So thank you all for joining, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.